The autumn rain drummed against the cracked windows of the abandoned Greyhound station in downtown Portland, Oregon. Marcus Rodriguez adjusted his worn leather gloves and shifted his weight on the makeshift skateboard that had become his legs. 3 years ago, the IED blast in Afghanistan had taken more than his ability to walk. It had stolen his sense of purpose, his identity, everything he thought he knew about himself. "Spare some change?" he asked a businessman hurrying past, but the man's eyes slid over him like he was part of the concrete. Marcus had grown accustomed to this particular kind of invisibility. People saw the empty pant legs, the weathered military jacket, the cardboard sign that read "Homeless Vet, Anything Helps," and they looked away. It was easier than acknowledging what he represented, a reminder that heroes sometimes came home broken. The station buzzed with the usual late afternoon crowd. Commuters clutched coffee cups and smartphones, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of screens. A young mother struggled with a stroller while balancing grocery bags. An elderly man dozed in a corner chair, his newspaper folded across his chest. Marcus had learned to read the rhythms of this place, the ebb and flow of human desperation and hope. "You can't stay here all day," Officer Jana Mills said, approaching with the weary expression of someone who'd had this conversation before. She was one of the few who actually looked him in the eye, treated him like a person rather than a problem to be solved. "I'm not causing trouble," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the slight rasp that came from too many nights sleeping rough. "Just trying to stay dry." "I know, Marcus, but you know how it is. Complaints from the business owners." She glanced around the station, her hand resting on her radio. "There's a shelter opening up on Morrison Street. Clean beds, hot meals." Marcus shook his head. He'd tried the shelters before: the overcrowding, the theft, the way some people looked at him like his disability made him weak. "I'm good here. Won't cause any problems," Officer Mills sighed, the sound lost in the steady patter of rain against glass. "Weather Service is saying this fog's going to get worse tonight. Visibility down to maybe 10 feet. You sure you don't want to reconsider?" Before Marcus could respond, a commotion erupted near the ticket counter. A woman in her early 30s, Sarah Chen, was arguing with a clerk, her voice rising with each word. She held a 6-month-old baby against her chest, the child's cries adding to the chaos. "You don't understand," Sarah was saying, tears streaming down her face. "I have to get to Seattle tonight. My mother, she's in the hospital. They said she might not make it through the night." The clerk, a tired-looking man in his 50s, spread his hands helplessly. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but the last bus to Seattle left 20 minutes ago. With this fog rolling in, we've had to cancel the evening routes. It's just not safe." Marcus watched the scene unfold, something stirring in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in months. The woman's desperation was palpable, her fear raw and real. The baby, sensing his mother's distress, wailed louder. "Please," Sarah begged. "There has to be something. A taxi, anything." "No taxi's going to drive in this fog," the clerk said. "And even if one would, it'd cost you $800, maybe more." Sarah's shoulders sagged. She fumbled in her purse, pulling out a thin wallet. "I have $67. That's all I have." The station fell into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the baby's cries and the sound of rain. Marcus felt eyes on him, not the usual dismissive glances, but something different. A few people had noticed him watching, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disdain. "Why don't you ask him?" a teenager said, nodding toward Marcus with a smirk. "He's got nothing better to do." The cruel laughter that followed hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd endured worse, much worse, but the casual cruelty still stung. Sarah looked over at him, her eyes red-rimmed and desperate. For a moment, their gazes met, and Marcus saw something he recognized, the look of someone who felt utterly alone. Officer Mills touched his shoulder. "Come on, Marcus. Let's get you out of here." But Marcus couldn't move. The woman's pain was too familiar, too real. He'd felt that same helplessness in the hospital bed in Germany, when the doctors had told him his legs couldn't be saved. He'd felt it when he'd called his ex-wife and heard the relief in her voice. Relief that she finally had a reason to leave. "Ma'am," Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the station. Sarah turned toward him. her expression uncertain. "I couldn't help but overhear," he continued, rolling his skateboard closer. "Seattle, you said?" Sarah nodded, shifting the baby to her other arm. "My mother's at Harborview Medical Center. She had a stroke this morning." Her voice broke. "I have to get there." Marcus looked out at the fog that was already beginning to creep along the street. Thick and gray like smoke. In a few hours, it would be a white wall of nothing. The kind of fog that turned familiar streets into alien landscapes. He thought about the woman's desperation, the baby's cries, the casual cruelty of the teenager's words. "I know a way," he said quietly. The station seemed to hold its breath. Officer Mills looked at him with concern. "Marcus, what are you thinking?" "I've got a friend," Marcus said, the light coming easily. "Drives freight. He's heading north tonight, fog or no fog. He could get you to Seattle." Hope flickered in Sarah's eyes. "Really? How much would it cost?" Marcus glanced at her thin wallet, at the baby who had finally quieted, at the faces around them, some curious, some skeptical, most simply indifferent. "Nothing," he said. "Just a favor for a fellow human being." The teenager from before laughed. "Yeah, right. What's the catch, Wheels?" Heat flared in Marcus's chest, but he kept his voice steady. "No catch. Sometimes people just help each other out." Sarah stepped closer, studying his face. "You'd really do that? For a stranger?" Marcus met her gaze, seeing something shift in her expression, not pity, but recognition. "Human to human, we're all strangers until we're not," he said. Officer Mills shook her head. "Marcus, I don't think it's okay," Marcus said. "I know what I'm doing." He didn't, of course. He had no friend, no freight driver, no plan beyond the desperate need to ease someone else's pain. But as he looked at Sarah's face, at the hope beginning to bloom there, he knew he'd figure something out. He had to. The fog continued to thicken outside, and Marcus Rodriguez, invisible man, forgotten veteran, legless drifter, was about to discover that sometimes the greatest journeys begin with a single act of compassion. Marcus led Sarah and baby Emma out of the station into the thickening Portland fog. The lie about his freight driver friend hung between them like the mist itself, substantial enough to obscure the truth, but fragile enough to dissolve under scrutiny. His skateboard wheels clicked against the wet pavement as they moved down Morrison Street, the familiar rhythm now carrying an unfamiliar burden, someone else's desperate hope. "Your friend," Sarah said, adjusting Emma's blanket against the damp air. "Where exactly are we meeting him?" Marcus's mind raced. The fog was getting thicker by the minute, swallowing streetlights and turning the city into a maze of gray shadows. He'd bought himself time with the lie, but now he needed a miracle. He's at the freight yard. About 2 miles from here. 2 miles? Sarah's voice carried a note of concern. "In this fog, I know these streets like the back of my hand," Marcus said, which was true. 3 years of living on them had taught him every alley, every shortcut, every safe place to rest. "And the fog's good for us, keeps the traffic light." They moved through the empty streets, Marcus leading on his skateboard, Sarah walking beside him with Emma in her arms. The baby had fallen asleep, her tiny face peaceful despite the chaos of the day. The fog muffled sounds, making their footsteps seem loud in the eerie quiet. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said after they'd walked for several minutes. "Sure. Why are you helping me? I mean, you don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Marcus was quiet for a moment, the only sound the whisper of his wheels against wet concrete. "You ever have one of those moments where you see yourself clearly, like, really see who you've become?" Sarah nodded. "When Emma was born, I looked at her, and I realized I had no idea how to be a mother. I was terrified. That's how I felt back at the station," Marcus said. "I saw this kid laughing at me, saw all those people looking through me like I was nothing, and I thought, this is what I am now. This is what I've become." He paused, navigating around the fire hydrant, lost in the fog. "But then I saw you, your pain, your fear, and I realized I could still be something more than just this." They passed a 24-hour diner, its neon sign a blurry beacon in the fog. Through the windows, Marcus could see a few customers nursing coffee, probably waiting for the weather to clear. He thought about stopping, about confessing his lie and asking for help. But something held him back, maybe pride, maybe stubbornness, maybe just the need to prove to himself that he wasn't completely broken. "Tell me about your mother," Marcus said, wanting to focus on something other than his growing desperation. Sarah's face softened. She immigrated from Taiwan when she was 22, worked 2 jobs to put herself through nursing school. "She's the strongest person I know." Her voice cracked. "She called me this morning, said she was feeling dizzy. By the time I got to her apartment, she was unconscious. The paramedics said. They said it was a massive stroke. She sounds like a fighter." "She is, but she's also 73, and she's been working herself to death for 50 years. The doctors said the next 24 hours are critical." Sarah shifted Emma to her other arm. "I can't lose her. Not now. Emma needs her grandmother." Marcus felt the weight of Sarah's trust, the magnitude of what he'd promised. 2 miles through fog that was getting thicker by the minute, with no real plan and no actual help waiting. At the end, but something had changed in him since leaving the station. The familiar numbness that had protected him for 3 years was cracking, and underneath it, he found something he'd thought was gone forever: purpose. They reached the industrial district, where warehouses and freight yards stretched out like sleeping giants in the fog. Marcus knew this area well. He'd spent many nights here, hidden from police and protected from the worst of the weather. The fog was so thick now that they could barely see 10 feet ahead. "Your friend," Sarah said, her voice tight with worry. "Which building?" Marcus stopped, his heart hammering. They stood at the edge of a vast freight yard, dozens of trucks and trailers barely visible through the mist. The truth was, he'd been hoping for a miracle, for some stroke of luck that would make his lie into reality. But there was no friend, no freight driver, no way to get Sarah to Seattle. "Marcus?" Sarah's voice was small, frightened. "Which building?" He opened his mouth to confess, to apologize, to admit that he'd let his need to help override his ability to actually provide that help. But before he could speak, a voice called out through the fog. "That you, Marcus?" A figure emerged from the mist, a tall man in coveralls, his face weathered and kind. Marcus recognized him immediately. Tommy Brennan, a freight driver who'd occasionally shared coffee and conversation during those long, cold nights when sleep wouldn't come. "Tommy," Marcus said, hardly daring to believe it. "Heard you calling my name," Tommy said, approaching with the careful steps of someone navigating blind. "Everything okay?" Marcus looked at Sarah, at the hope flickering back to life in her eyes, at sleeping Emma. Sometimes miracles came disguised as coincidence, as the simple kindness of a man who'd bothered to remember a homeless veteran's name. "Actually," Marcus said, his voice steady for the first time all day, "I was hoping you might be able to help my friend here. She needs to get to Seattle tonight." Tommy looked at Sarah, taking in her tear-stained face and the baby in her arms. "Seattle, in this fog? That's a hell of a drive." "It's an emergency," Sarah said quickly. "My mother's in the hospital. They said she might not make it through the night." Tommy was quiet for a moment, studying the fog that swirled around them, like a living thing. "Well," he said finally, "good thing I know these roads like the back of my hand. And good thing I've got a delivery to make in Tacoma first thing in the morning." Sarah's legs nearly gave out. With relief. "You'll take me?" "How much?" "No charge," Tommy said, glancing at Marcus with understanding. "Friend of Marcus's is a friend of mine. But I've got to warn you, it's going to be a rough ride. We'll be moving slow, and that fog's not going to clear until morning." "I don't care," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you. Thank you so much." As they walked toward Tommy's truck, Marcus felt something shift inside him. The numbness was still there, but it was no longer complete. Through the cracks, he could feel something growing, not the old confidence, not the person he'd been before Afghanistan, but something new, something that might, in time, become hope. "You coming with us?" Tommy asked as they reached the truck. Marcus looked at the cab, at the space that would be tight even for 3 people. "I think I'll stay here. I've got things to take care of." Sarah turned to him, Emma still sleeping in her arms. "Marcus, I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to," he said. "Just tell your mother that a stranger was rooting for her." As Tommy's truck disappeared into the fog, its taillights fading like red stars, Marcus sat alone in the freight yard. The fog pressed around him. But for the first time in 3 years, he didn't feel lost. He felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The rain would return, the cold would seep into his bones, and the world would continue to look through him as if he were invisible. But tonight, he had helped someone. Tonight, he had mattered. And sometimes, that was enough to change everything. The fog on Interstate 5 was unlike anything Tommy Brennan had encountered in 23 years of long-haul trucking. It rolled across the highway like a living thing, thick as cotton and twice as stubborn. His headlights barely penetrated 10 feet ahead, and the yellow line that should have guided them north towards Seattle kept disappearing into the gray void. "How are you doing back there?" Tommy called over the rumble of the diesel engine. Sarah sat in the sleeper cabin behind the driver's seat, Emma finally resting peacefully in her lap. The baby had been fussy for the first hour of the drive, sensing her mother's anxiety. But the steady rhythm of the truck had eventually lulled her to sleep. Sarah's eyes were red-rimmed from crying and exhaustion, but she managed a weak smile. "We're okay," she said, "just grateful to be moving." Tommy nodded, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel. He'd been driving since he was 19, had seen every kind of weather the Pacific Northwest could throw at him. But this fog was something else entirely. It seemed to press against the windshield like a living thing. And more than once he'd had to slow to 15 miles per hour when the road disappeared completely. "Tell me about your friend," Sarah said, needing something to focus on other than the creeping fear that they might not make it in time. "Marcus. How do you know him?" Tommy was quiet for a moment, navigating around what looked like the taillights of a stalled car. "Met him about 2 years ago. I was making a delivery to Portland, running late, and I stopped at this all-night diner. He was sitting outside in the rain, just sitting there. Looked like he hadn't eaten in days." "What did you do?" "Bought him a meal. Coffee, eggs, toast, nothing fancy. We got to talking, and he told me about Afghanistan, about losing his legs, about how he'd lost everything else too." Tommy's voice grew softer. "He never asked for anything after that first meal, but whenever I was in Portland, I'd look for him. Share coffee, maybe a sandwich. He's got this way of listening, you know, like he really hears what you're saying." Sarah adjusted Emma in her arms, thinking about the man who'd risked everything to help a stranger. "He lied to me, didn't he? About having a friend who could drive me to Seattle." "Probably," Tommy said. "But sometimes the best people are the ones who lie for the right reasons." The fog seemed to be getting thicker, if that was possible. Tommy had to slow down again, squinting through the windshield at the ghostly shapes of other vehicles. A few cars had pulled over to the shoulder, their hazard lights blinking uselessly in the murk. He'd seen 3 accidents already, fender benders where drivers had rear-ended each other. In the zero visibility, "I keep thinking about what he said," Sarah continued, "about seeing himself clearly. I know what he means. Before Emma was born, I thought I had my life figured out. Good job, nice apartment, plans for the future. Then my daughter came along, and suddenly I realized how alone I was, how much I'd been taking my mother for granted." "Kids have a way of doing that," Tommy said, "stripping away all the things that don't matter, showing you what really counts." They drove in comfortable silence for a while, the truck's engine providing a steady counterpoint to the fog-muffled world outside. Sarah found herself thinking about Marcus, about the moment in the bus station when their eyes had met. There had been something in his expression, not pity, not judgment, just recognition. One human being seeing another. "Tommy," she said suddenly, "can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Do you think he'll be okay, Marcus? I mean, out there in this fog?" Tommy considered the question, his eyes never leaving the road. "I think Marcus Rodriguez is a lot stronger than he knows. He's been surviving on these streets for 3 years, and that takes more than just luck. It takes will." He paused. "Besides, something tells me tonight changed something for him. Maybe for all of us." The fog began to thin slightly as they climbed into the hills south of Seattle. Sarah could make out the silhouettes of trees, the occasional billboard, the distant glow of the city ahead. Her heart began to race as they got closer to Harborview Medical Center, fear and hope warring in her chest. Almost there, Tommy said, checking his GPS. You want me to wait? Drive you back to Portland? No, Sarah said, surprising herself. With the firmness in her voice. I need to be here, whatever happens. Emma needs to be here. And besides, she added with a small smile, I need to find a way to thank Marcus properly. Tommy navigated through the city streets, the fog still thick but manageable in the urban environment. When they pulled up to the hospital, Sarah felt a wave of gratitude so strong it almost knocked her over. This stranger, this kind, generous man had driven through dangerous conditions to help someone he'd never met. Tommy, she said, gathering Emma and her small bag. I don't know how to thank you. Don't need to, he said, echoing Marcus's words from earlier. Just take care of your mother and that beautiful baby. As Sarah walked toward the hospital entrance, Emma stirring in her arms, she felt the weight of the night's events. A homeless veteran had lied to help her. A truck driver had risked his life to drive through impossible conditions. Strangers had become guardian angels in the space of a few hours. The fog was already beginning to lift, the first hints of dawn touching the edges of the sky. Soon, the sun would burn away the mist, and the world would return to normal. But Sarah Chen knew she would never be the same. She had been reminded that kindness existed in the most unexpected places, that heroes didn't always wear uniforms or live in nice houses. Sometimes they lived on the streets, invisible to most of the world, until the moment when someone needed them most. And sometimes, that was exactly when they became visible again, not just to others, but to themselves. As she pushed through the hospital doors, Emma warm and sleeping in her arms, Sarah carried with her the gift Marcus had given her, the knowledge that she wasn't alone, that there were still people in the world who would risk everything to help. A stranger in need. The fog might have lifted, but the memory of that kindness would stay with her forever. 3 weeks later, Marcus Rodriguez sat in the same spot at the Greyhound station. But everything had changed. The autumn rain had given way to crisp November air, and the morning sun streamed through the windows with a clarity that seemed impossible. After that foggy night, he still had his cardboard sign, still had his skateboard, still had the empty pant legs that marked him as different. But something fundamental had shifted. The local news crew was packing up their equipment, having just finished interviewing him for a follow-up story. The reporter, a earnest young woman named Jessica Martinez, had tracked him down after Sarah's story went viral on social media. Local veteran helps stranger in need, had become the fog angel of Portland, and suddenly everyone wanted to know about the homeless. Manhood orchestrated a miracle. Thank you again for your time, Marcus, Jessica said, shaking his hand. This story has really touched people. You've received over 50 job offers, and the GoFundMe page that Sarah set up has raised almost $200,000. Marcus nodded, still uncomfortable with the attention. It's appreciated, all of it, but I didn't do it for recognition. I know, Jessica said. That's what makes it so remarkable. As the news crew left, Marcus noticed a familiar figure approaching. Through the crowd, Sarah Chen walked toward him, Emma in her arms. And for a moment he was transported back to that desperate night when she'd begged for help getting to Seattle. Marcus, she said, and he could hear the emotion in her voice. I've been looking for you, Sarah. He felt a smile tugging at his lips. How's your mother? She's home. Recovering. The doctors said it was touch and go for a while, but she's strong, stubborn too. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I was with her when she woke up. I got to hold her hand, got to tell her I loved her. Because of you. Emma, now more alert than she'd been that foggy night, stared down at Marcus with curious eyes. He found himself making faces at her, delighted when she giggled. She likes you, Sarah said. I think she remembers your voice from the truck. Hard to forget a voice this ugly, Marcus said, but he was smiling. Sarah sat down on the bench beside him, adjusting Emma on her lap. I need to tell you something. About that night, about what you did. I know you didn't really have a friend who could drive me to Seattle. Marcus looked away. Embarrassed. I'm sorry. I couldn't stand to see you like that. I thought maybe I could figure something out. You did figure something out. Sarah said firmly. You took a leap of faith, and it worked. Tommy told me he heard you calling his name, but that's impossible. You couldn't have known he was there. Lucky coincidence, Marcus said. Or maybe, Sarah said, maybe when you do something good for someone, the universe finds a way to help you succeed. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the morning crowd bustle around them. People still walked past Marcus, but now some of them nodded, smiled, dropped money in his cup. A few even stopped to talk, to thank him for reminding them that heroes could be found anywhere. I have a proposition for you, Sarah said finally. My mother owns a small restaurant in Chinatown. She's been running it by herself for 15 years, but since the stroke, she needs help. Not just with the heavy lifting, but with the books, with dealing with customers, with managing the staff. Marcus looked at her, not quite understanding. Okay, I'm offering you a job, Sarah said. Full-time, with benefits. And there's a small apartment above the restaurant. It's not much, but it's clean and warm and it's yours if you want it. Marcus stared at her, speechless. After 3 years of being invisible, of being dismissed and ignored, someone was offering him not just work, but a home, a purpose. I don't know anything about restaurants, he said finally. You can learn. My mother's an excellent teacher, and she's eager to meet the man who helped her daughter. Sarah shifted Emma to her other arm. Besides, you proved that night that you can solve problems, that you can think on your feet. That's more valuable than experience. Why? Marcus asked. Why would you do this for me? Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, the way she had that night in the bus station. Because 3 weeks ago, when I was desperate and scared and completely alone, you saw me, really saw me. You didn't look away, you didn't make excuses, you didn't pass by, you helped. She paused. And because I think you need to know that you're not invisible, not to everyone. Marcus felt tears welling up in his eyes. For 3 years, he'd been drifting, existing, but not really living. He'd convinced himself that Afghanistan had taken everything from him, his legs, his wife, his sense of self. But sitting here in the morning sunlight, with Sarah's offer hanging in the air between them, he realized he'd been wrong. He hadn't lost everything. He'd lost some things, important things, but he'd gained something too. He'd learned that heroism wasn't about being perfect or whole or having all the answers. It was about seeing someone in need and deciding to help, even when, especially when you didn't know how. When do I start? He asked. Sarah's smile was brighter than the morning sun. How about right now? My mother's making dumplings this afternoon, and she says she needs someone to taste test them. Apparently, it's a very important job. Marcus laughed, the sound feeling foreign after years of silence. I guess I better not disappoint her. As they made their way through the streets of Portland, Sarah walking beside him as he navigated on his skateboard, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope, not the desperate, clawing hope of survival, but the steady, warm hope of belonging. The fog had lifted, literally and figuratively, and Marcus Rodriguez was finally coming home. Behind them, the Greyhound station continued its daily rhythm of arrivals and departures, of desperate people and routine commuters, of stories that began and ended with the simple act of moving from one place to another. But for one man who had been invisible for too long, the journey was just beginning. Sometimes the most important destinations weren't marked on any map. Sometimes they were found in the moment when someone looked at you and saw not what you'd lost, but what you still had to give. And sometimes, the fog that seemed to obscure everything was actually clearing the way for something better than you'd ever imagined possible. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last wisps of mist, and Marcus Rodriguez rolled toward his future, no longer alone, no longer invisible, no longer lost. He was finally found.